The old Victorian house on Maple Street had been empty for 15 years. Everyone in Millbrook knew about it. Kids would dare each other to run up and touch the front door. Adults would shake their heads whenever they drove past, wondering why such a beautiful building was left to rot. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the garden had turned into a jungle of weeds and overgrown bushes. In March 2026, things finally changed. The Mitchell family bought the place for a price that made the whole town gossip. Some said they got it dirt cheap because of its condition. Others whispered that no amount of money could fix what was wrong with that house. But the Mitchells didn't seem to care about the rumors. They had 3 kids, needed more space, and saw potential where others saw problems. Robert Mitchell was a contractor by trade, which made the decision easier. His wife, Linda, taught music at the local high school. They figured between his skills and their tight budget, they could turn the old mansion into their dream home. Their kids were excited too. 12-year-old Tommy claimed the attic room before they even signed the papers. 9-year-old Lisa wanted the bedroom with the window seat. Even little 6-year-old Jack was thrilled about having a big backyard to play in. The first few weeks were all about cleaning. 15 years of dust, cobwebs, and mouse droppings don't disappear overnight. Linda's sister came to help, along with a few friends from church. They filled dozens of garbage bags with debris and old curtains that fell apart when touched. The house slowly started to reveal its bones, and despite the work needed, those bones were good. Robert started the real renovation in April. He began with the roof, then moved to the plumbing and electrical. By May, he was working on the interior walls. That's when things got interesting. He was in what used to be the music parlor, a large room on the first floor with high ceilings and big windows facing the garden. The previous owners, whoever they were, had done some odd renovation work. There was a wall that didn't quite match the others. It looked newer, though still decades old. Robert knocked on it one afternoon, just testing. It sounded hollow. He frowned and knocked again in different spots. Definitely hollow. He grabbed his tools and carefully removed a section of drywall. Behind it was an older wall, but this one had a door that had been completely sealed up and hidden. His heart started beating faster. You hear stories about people finding things in old houses. Money, jewelry, old letters. Sometimes it's treasure. Sometimes it's just junk. But there's always that moment of possibility. That flutter of excitement before you know what you've got. He called Linda. She came running, wiping her hands on her jeans. Tommy heard the commotion and followed his mom. Within minutes, the whole family was crowded in the music parlor, staring at the door Robert had uncovered. The door was locked. Robert tried the handle a few times, but it wouldn't budge. He could have forced it, but something made him hesitate. This felt important somehow. Instead, he carefully removed the hinges. It took 20 minutes of work, but finally the door came free. The room beyond was dark and stuffy. Robert shined his flashlight inside. The beam caught something large and dark in the center of the small room. As their eyes adjusted and Robert stepped inside, they all gasped at the same time. It was a piano. Not just any piano, but a grand piano. A huge, beautiful Steinway that sat there like a sleeping giant. Dust covered every inch of it, thick as a blanket. But underneath you could see the rich black polish, the elegant curves, the ivory and ebony keys. Why would someone wall up a piano? Linda whispered. Nobody had an answer. They all just stood there, staring. Tommy wanted to touch it right away, but Linda stopped him. Something about the scene felt sacred, like they'd stumbled into a tomb. Over the next few days, Robert carefully moved the piano out of the hidden room. It took 6 men and a specialized dolly, plus a lot of sweat and careful maneuvering. They positioned it in the music parlor where it belonged. Linda couldn't stop looking at it. As a music teacher, she knew quality when she saw it. This piano was worth serious money, even after sitting locked away for who knows how long. She opened the bench to look for any information about the piano. That's when she found the treasures. Inside the bench were stacks of handwritten sheet music. Not printed music, but original compositions written in careful, flowing handwriting. There were dozens of pieces, each one titled and dated. The dates ranged from 1975 to 1978. Underneath the music were photographs, old pictures from the 70s, judging by the clothes and hairstyles. Most showed a woman at various pianos. Sometimes she was performing for an audience. Other times she was teaching students. In some pictures she was just sitting at a piano, caught in a moment of concentration. She was beautiful in an understated way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. At the very bottom of the bench was a leather-bound journal. Linda lifted it carefully. The leather was soft with age, and the pages had that old paper smell. She opened to the first page and read the name written there in the same elegant handwriting from the sheet music. Eleanor Whitmore. Below the name was written, "My musical journey and more." Linda called Robert over. They sat together on the piano bench and started reading. The first entries were about music, about performances Eleanor had given, about students she was teaching. Her love for music came through in every word. She wrote about how a piece of Chopin could make her cry, how teaching a child to play their first scale was like watching a flower bloom. But as Linda flipped through the pages, the entries changed. They became less about music and more about something else, something that made Linda's stomach tighten with unease. Tommy came bounding into the room. "Mom, can I try playing the piano?" Linda closed the journal quickly. "Not yet, honey. We need to have it cleaned and tuned first. Plus, we need to figure out who it belonged to." That evening, after the kids were in bed, Linda and Robert sat at their kitchen table with the journal, the photographs and some of the sheet music spread out before them. They'd done a quick internet search for Eleanor Whitmore and found something that made the whole situation even more mysterious. Eleanor Whitmore had been a pianist in Millbrook. She'd lived in their house, the very house they'd just bought. She'd been well known in town, beloved even. She'd taught dozens of students and performed regularly at community events. And then in October 1978, she'd disappeared, just vanished without a trace. The news articles from that time said she'd left town, possibly moved to Europe to pursue her career. Some of her belongings were gone, which supported that theory, but others said it didn't make sense. She'd had students scheduled for lessons. She'd been planning a Christmas concert. She'd never said goodbye to anyone, and now, here was her piano, walled up in a hidden room, along with her personal compositions, her photographs, and her journal. "This doesn't feel right," Linda said quietly. Robert nodded. "The question is, what do we do about it?" They decided to read more of the journal before making any decisions. As Linda turned the pages reading Eleanor's words from nearly 50 years ago, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a hidden piano. This wasn't just an antique they'd found. This was a story that had been sealed away, waiting all these years to be told. And something told her that Eleanor Whitmore hadn't left town of her own free will. Something had happened in this house, in this very room where Linda now sat, something that someone had wanted buried and forgotten. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Sometimes all it takes is the right person knocking on the wrong wall, and everything comes tumbling out into the light. Linda couldn't sleep that night. The journal sat on her nightstand, calling to her. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up trying to rest and went downstairs with a cup of tea. She settled into the armchair in the music parlor, right next to Eleanor's piano, and began reading by lamplight. The early entries were delightful. Eleanor wrote about a recital she'd performed in Boston, about a student who'd finally mastered a difficult piece after months of trying, about the joy of discovering a new composer. She had a warm writing style that made Linda feel like they were old friends chatting over coffee. But then, in an entry dated March 1977, the tone shifted. Eleanor wrote about a conversation she'd overheard at the town hall. She'd been there to discuss music programs for the schools when she'd heard raised voices from a nearby office. The door was slightly open and she couldn't help but hear. The mayor at the time, a man named Richard Thornton, was talking to the town treasurer about funds for the new children's hospital. But something in the conversation didn't sound right to Eleanor. Numbers didn't match. There were mentions of private accounts and adjusted records. She didn't understand it all, but her gut told her something was wrong. Linda sat up straighter. This was getting serious. She read on. Over the next several months, Eleanor wrote about noticing more strange things. The Children's Hospital project was moving slowly, despite the town having raised considerable money for it. Fundraisers had been hugely successful. Local businesses had donated. Even kids had held bake sales and car washes. Everyone in Millbrook had contributed something because the nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and the town desperately needed better medical facilities. But construction kept getting delayed. Costs kept going up, and Eleanor, who served on the hospital fundraising committee, started asking questions. The more she asked, the more uncomfortable people became. In June 1977, Eleanor wrote about meeting with the hospital project accountant, a nervous man who seemed scared of his own shadow. He'd stammered through explanations that didn't make sense. When Eleanor pressed him gently, he looked around to make sure no one was listening and whispered, "Stop asking questions. For your own good." That warning had the opposite effect. Eleanor started paying closer attention. She began keeping notes of every meeting, every financial report, every update on the hospital project. She taught herself basic accounting by checking out library books. She compared what the committee was told with public records at the town hall, and she discovered something shocking. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been moved around in ways that didn't add up. Money that should have gone to construction materials seemed to disappear into vague categories like administrative costs and consulting fees. Companies that supposedly received payment for services had addresses that didn't exist. Some weren't even real companies at all. Linda felt cold despite her tea. She was reading about a massive theft, a betrayal of an entire community's trust, and Eleanor had figured it out. The journal entries from late 1977 and early 1978 showed Eleanor becoming more determined and more careful. She wrote about making copies of documents, about keeping everything in a safe place. She mentioned talking to a lawyer in the next town over, someone who didn't know the people involved. The lawyer had told her she had enough evidence to involve state authorities, but Eleanor wanted to be absolutely certain before she went that far. She knew what she was accusing people of. These were respected community members. Mayor Thornton had been in office for 12 years. His family had been in Millbrook for generations. She needed her evidence to be ironclad. In one particularly chilling entry from August 1978, Eleanor wrote about feeling watched. A car had been parked outside her house for hours one evening. When she went to check, it drove away. Another time, she was certain someone had been in her house while she was out teaching. Nothing was stolen, but things were moved slightly. Her papers had been shuffled through. She started keeping the most important documents with her at all times. She made multiple copies of everything and gave them to her lawyer with instructions to open them if anything happened to her. She was scared, but she was also determined. "These families trusted us with their money, with their hopes for better health care," she wrote. "Their children deserve better. I can't just walk away from this." Linda had to stop reading. Her hands were shaking. She looked around her new home, this beautiful house that had belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Had Eleanor sat in this very room writing these words knowing she was in danger? She forced herself to keep reading. The final entries were the hardest. September 1978 brought a breakthrough. Eleanor had gotten copies of bank statements that showed exactly where some of the money had gone. Payments to shell companies that eventually funneled money into personal accounts. She had names, dates, amounts. She had everything she needed. On October 10, 1978, Eleanor wrote that she'd made an appointment to meet with a state investigator on October 15th. She'd told only her lawyer about the meeting. She planned to hand over all her evidence and let the proper authorities handle it from there. She was nervous but relieved. Soon this whole mess would be out of her hands. The next entry was dated October 12th. It was shorter than usual. Eleanor wrote about receiving a phone call that evening. Someone had called asking her to come to a meeting at the town hall to discuss the hospital project. It was urgent, they said. There had been a breakthrough in funding. They needed her input right away. Eleanor was suspicious. Why would they call her so late in the evening? Why the sudden urgency after months of delays? But she also didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe this was legitimate. Maybe the project was finally moving forward. She wrote that she would go, but stay cautious. She'd keep the meeting short and leave her evidence safely locked away at home. That was the last entry. October 12, 1978. Linda turned the page, hoping for more. There was nothing. The rest of the journal was blank. Eleanor Whitmore had written her last words and then vanished 3 days later. Linda sat in the quiet house listening to the old buildings settle and creak. She thought about Eleanor walking out of this house that October evening, heading to a meeting she'd been suspicious about, but attended anyway. Had she known she was in danger? Had she had any idea she'd never come back? The news articles Linda had found online said Eleanor's disappearance was treated as a voluntary departure. Some of her clothes were gone. Her car was found at the train station. The investigation concluded she'd left town, probably to pursue opportunities in Europe or New York. Case closed. But Linda knew better now. Eleanor hadn't packed those bags. Someone else had. trying to make it look like she'd left voluntarily. Eleanor had been planning to expose corruption at the highest levels of town government. And just days before she could do that, she disappeared. The question was what had happened to the evidence she'd gathered. Eleanor had written about keeping copies in multiple locations, about giving documents to her lawyer. But nothing had ever come out. The mayor had continued in office for years after Eleanor's disappearance. The hospital project had eventually been completed, though it took much longer and cost much more than originally planned. Everything had just continued as if Eleanor Whitmore had never existed. Linda looked at the piano, at the photographs, at the sheet music. Eleanor's entire life had been sealed behind a wall, hidden away like it never mattered. Someone had gone to great trouble to make sure Eleanor and everything she knew stayed buried, but they'd made one mistake. They'd left the journal. Maybe they never found it. Maybe they didn't know Eleanor kept one. Or maybe they thought sealing the room was enough, that no one would ever find it. They were wrong. As dawn light started filtering through the windows, Linda made a decision. She couldn't just keep quiet about this. Eleanor Whitmore had risked everything to expose the truth. The least Linda could do was make sure that truth finally came out, even if it was nearly 50 years late. She woke Robert and showed him what she'd read. His face grew serious as he scanned the pages. "This is bigger than us," he said finally. "We need to take this to someone official." They decided to start with the local newspaper. If Eleanor's story was going to come out, it deserved to be told properly. The Millbrook Gazette had been publishing since 1892. Surely they'd be interested in solving a mystery that was almost 5 decades old. That afternoon, Linda called the newspaper. She spoke with a reporter named Claire Patterson, who'd been with the paper for 15 years. Claire listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Linda finished, there was a long pause. "Can I come see the journal?" Claire finally asked. "If what you're saying is true, this is the biggest story Millbrook has seen in decades." They agreed to meet the next day. Linda spent that evening reading through the journal again, this time making notes and marking important passages. She also looked through all the sheet music and photographs, trying to piece together a complete picture of who Eleanor Whitmore had been. One photograph particularly caught her attention. It showed Eleanor with a group of students all smiling at the camera. They looked to be teenagers, probably high school age. On the back, Eleanor had written names and a date. Spring Recital, 1978. Linda studied each young face, wondering where these people were now. They'd be in their 60s, old enough to remember their teacher. Old enough to care about what had happened to her. Robert came in and looked over her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Eleanor had a lot of people who cared about her. Students, friends, people in this community. And they all deserve to know the truth about what happened. They still do." The next day, Claire Patterson arrived with a photographer. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She examined the journal carefully, taking pictures of key pages. She looked through the photographs and sheet music. She asked Linda and Robert dozens of questions about finding the hidden room, about the condition of everything, about the exact dates. "This is real," Claire said finally. "This is really real." "Do you understand what this means?" Linda nodded. "It means someone got away with murder." The story hit the front page of the Millbrook Gazette on a Thursday morning. The headline read, "Hidden Journal Reveals Dark Secrets Behind Local Woman's 1978 Disappearance." By noon, everyone in town had heard about it. By evening, Millbrook was split right down the middle. Claire Patterson had done her homework. Her article didn't just share what Eleanor's journal said. She dug up the old case file on Eleanor's disappearance and compared it to Eleanor's account. She'd found discrepancies, things that didn't match, questions that should have been asked but weren't. She'd also looked into the hospital project finances and found records that supported Eleanor's concerns about missing money. The article was careful not to make direct accusations, but anyone reading it could connect the dots. Eleanor Whitmore had been investigating corruption. She'd been about to expose it. Then she'd vanished, and the investigation into her disappearance had been suspiciously quick to conclude she'd left voluntarily. Linda's phone started ringing that same morning and barely stopped. Some callers were supportive, thanking her for bringing this to light. But others were angry, accusing her of stirring up trouble and trying to destroy reputations based on old journal entries that could be fiction for all anyone knew. At the high school where Linda taught, the staff room was buzzing. Some teachers remembered Eleanor Whitmore or had heard stories about her. They wanted to know everything. Others thought Linda should have left well enough alone. But what if she's right? Asked Beth, who taught history. What if Eleanor Whitmore was murdered to keep her quiet? That's a serious accusation, countered Frank, the vice principal. You can't just throw around charges like that based on a diary. Richard Thornton was a respected mayor. He served this town for years. Yeah, well, maybe that's the problem, Beth shot back. Maybe he served himself while pretending to serve the town. The debate spread everywhere. At the grocery store, in coffee shops, at the gas station, people were talking about nothing else. Millbrook was a small town where everyone knew everyone. This wasn't some distant scandal. It involved names they recognized, families who still lived there, places they walked past every day. The Thornton family still had deep roots in Millbrook. Richard Thornton, the mayor Eleanor had suspected, had died back in 1995. But his son, David Thornton, was now a prominent businessman and sat on the town council. David's kids went to the local schools. The Thorntons were woven into the fabric of the community. David Thornton held a press conference 3 days after the article ran. He stood in front of the old town hall with his wife beside him, his face tight with anger. These accusations against my late father are outrageous and hurtful, he said, his voice shaking. My father dedicated his life to this town. He worked tirelessly to make Millbrook a better place. This journal, if it's even real, is nothing but the paranoid fantasies of a woman who clearly had personal issues. My father is not here to defend himself, which makes these attacks even more cowardly. He went on to threaten legal action if anyone directly accused his father of wrongdoing. He called the whole thing a witch hunt, an attempt to rewrite history and destroy a good man's legacy for attention. The press conference worked on some people. Those who'd known Richard Thornton, who'd voted for him and trusted him, wanted to believe David was right. It was easier to think Eleanor had been confused or paranoid than to accept that their town's leadership had been corrupt. But it didn't work on everyone. The next day, another article appeared in the Gazette. This time, Claire Patterson had tracked down 3 of Eleanor's former students. All were now in their early 60s. All remembered their piano teacher fondly and were shocked by her sudden disappearance back in 1978. She never would have just left without saying goodbye, said one woman who'd been 13 when Eleanor vanished. I had a lesson scheduled for the week after she disappeared. She was excited about a piece I was learning. Then she was just gone, and everyone acted like it was normal. Even as a kid, I knew something was wrong. Another former student, now a retired accountant, said he'd always wondered about the hospital project. My dad was on the fundraising committee with Miss Whitmore. He used to talk about how the money wasn't adding up. Then Miss Whitmore disappeared, and suddenly my dad stopped asking questions. He wouldn't talk about it. Looking back, I think he was scared. These interviews gave Eleanor a human face again. She wasn't just a name from a dusty journal anymore. She was a real person people remembered and loved, someone who'd mattered. But the article also made things worse for the Mitchell family. That evening, Linda found a note taped to their front door. It was short and threatening. Stop digging up the past or you'll regret it. Some stones are better left unturned. Robert called the police. A young officer came, took the note, and made a report. He was sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. Probably just someone upset about all the controversy, he said. I doubt it's a real threat. Linda wasn't so sure. That night she had trouble sleeping again, but this time it wasn't because she was reading Eleanor's journal. It was because every sound made her jump. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, made her wonder if someone was outside. The controversy intensified when someone pointed out that the hospital project files from the late 70s were incomplete. Years of financial records that should have been archived at the town hall were missing. When Claire Patterson requested access to what remained, she was told there would be a delay due to the age of the documents and the need to verify proper protocols. They're stalling, Claire told Linda over coffee one morning. They don't want anyone looking too closely at those records. Can they do that? They can try, but I've got a request in under the Freedom of Information Act. They have to respond eventually. Meanwhile, other people were coming forward with their own memories. An elderly woman called the newspaper to say her late husband had been on the town council in the 70s. Before he died 10 years ago, he'd told her something had happened with the hospital money, but he'd been warned not to talk about it. He'd carried guilt about it his whole life. A retired contractor remembered being told to inflate invoices for work on the hospital project. He'd refused and lost the contract. He'd never understood why at the time, but it made sense now. Someone wanted the costs to appear higher on paper so they could pocket the difference. The pieces were coming together, and the picture they formed was ugly. But not everyone wanted to see it. About half the town still stood by the Thornton family. They saw the accusations as an attack on one of Millbrook's founding families. They believed David's version, that Eleanor had been troubled, that the journal wasn't reliable, that this was all much ado about nothing. The other half believed Eleanor and wanted justice, even if it was decades late. They wanted the truth, no matter how painful. They wanted to know what really happened to a beloved piano teacher who'd tried to do the right thing. The divide ran through families. At the local diner, two brothers got into a shouting match about it and had to be separated. At church, longtime friends stopped speaking to each other. The town council meetings became tense affairs where little business got done because people kept bringing up the controversy. Linda tried to stay out of the fighting. She'd simply found the piano and reported what she'd discovered. But people kept dragging her into it. Some praised her as a truth-teller. Others blamed her for tearing the community apart. Her kids were affected, too. Tommy came home from school upset one day because a classmate's father, a Thornton family friend, had told his son to stay away from those Mitchell troublemakers. Lisa overheard someone at the library say that Linda was probably making the whole thing up for attention. "Are we doing the right thing?" Linda asked Robert one night after the kids were in bed. He thought for a long moment. Eleanor Whitmore did the right thing, even though it cost her everything. I think we owe it to her to see this through. But yeah, it's hard. I won't pretend it isn't. 2 weeks after the first article, the Mitchell family started receiving phone calls late at night. Nobody spoke on the other end. The calls would come at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at 4. Just silence and then a hang-up. It was clearly meant to intimidate them, to wear them down. Robert changed their phone number. The calls stopped, but then their mailbox was vandalized. Someone spray-painted "liar" across it in red paint. Another police report was filed. Nothing came of it. Claire Patterson faced her own problems. The newspaper's advertising revenue dropped as some businesses pulled their ads in protest of the coverage. The publisher called her in for a serious conversation about whether continuing the story was worth the cost. But Claire, like Linda, had made a commitment. "This is journalism," she told her boss. "This is exactly what we're supposed to do. If we back down now, we're saying the powerful can do whatever they want and get away with it as long as enough time passes. I can't accept that." The publisher, an older man who'd run the Gazette for 30 years, studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, keep digging, but be careful, and be absolutely certain of your facts. We can't afford a lawsuit." So Claire kept digging. She put in more freedom of information requests. She interviewed more people. She went through old newspapers from the 70s, page by page, looking for anything relevant. And slowly, she built a stronger and stronger case that Eleanor Whitmore had been right about everything. The question was, what would it take to actually prove it? What would it take to convince the doubters? What would it take to get law enforcement to reopen a case that had been closed for nearly 5 decades? The answer came from an unexpected source, an old man named Henry Fletcher, who'd been the town's police detective back in 1978, called the newspaper one afternoon. He was 83 now, living in a nursing home 2 towns over. But his mind was sharp, and he had something to say. "I need to talk to someone," he told Claire, "about Eleanor Whitmore. I've kept quiet for too long. My conscience won't let me take this to my grave." Claire drove to see him that same day. What Henry Fletcher told her changed everything. Henry Fletcher sat in his wheelchair by the window of his nursing home room, staring out at the parking lot. When Claire arrived, he gestured for her to sit down. His hands shook slightly as he poured her a cup of coffee from a thermos. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for almost 50 years, he said. "I'm glad it finally happened before I died." He told Claire that he'd been a young detective in 1978, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself. When Eleanor Whitmore was reported missing, he'd been assigned to the case. Right from the start, things didn't add up. Eleanor's car had been found at the train station, but no one had seen her board a train. Her house showed signs that someone had hastily packed a bag, but neighbors reported seeing her car in the driveway late on the night of October 12th. If she'd left town, she would have had to do it in the middle of the night, which made no sense. Henry had wanted to investigate further. He'd wanted to interview everyone who'd seen Eleanor that last day. He'd wanted to search the woods around town to check hospitals to really dig into what happened. But he'd been stopped. The police chief at the time was a man named Walter Grant, Henry said. He told me in no uncertain terms that Eleanor Whitmore had left town voluntarily, and that was the end of it. When I pushed back, when I said I had doubts, he got angry. He told me I was too inexperienced to understand how things worked. He said I should stop wasting everyone's time and close the case. Henry had been young and scared of losing his job. He'd done as he was told. The case was officially closed within 2 weeks. Eleanor Whitmore was listed as a voluntary missing person, someone who'd chosen to leave her old life behind. But Henry had never forgotten. Over the years, he'd tried a few times to quietly reopen the investigation. Each time he'd been shut down. Eventually, he'd realized that something bigger was going on, something that powerful people wanted buried. "I started keeping my own files," Henry said, "copies of everything I could get my hands on. Witness statements that never made it into the official report. Notes from my own investigation before I was told to stop. I kept it all these years because I knew someday it might matter." He handed Claire a thick folder. Inside were documents that painted a very different picture from the official story. Witness statements from people who'd seen Eleanor on October 12th said she'd seemed worried, but not like someone planning to leave town. One neighbor had seen an unfamiliar car parked near Eleanor's house late that night. There were also notes about Walter Grant, the police chief. He'd been a close friend of Mayor Richard Thornton. They'd gone to school together, belonged to the same social clubs, went fishing together on weekends. When Eleanor disappeared, Grant had been quick to accept the simplest explanation and move on. "I think Walter was told to make the case go away," Henry said. "I don't know if he knew what really happened to Eleanor, but he definitely knew not to look too hard." Claire asked the obvious question. "Why didn't you ever come forward before?" Henry's eyes filled with tears. "Fear, mainly. And I'm ashamed of that. But by the time I worked up the courage, Walter was dead. Thornton was dead. And I figured no one would believe an old cop talking about ancient history. Then I saw your article about the journal, and I knew this was my chance to finally do the right thing." Claire thanked him and promised to handle the information carefully. She drove straight back to Millbrook and went to the police station. She asked to speak with the current police chief, a capable woman named Angela Rodriguez who'd been in charge for 5 years. Chief Rodriguez listened to everything Claire had to say. She looked through Henry Fletcher's files. Her expression grew more serious with each page. When Claire finished, the chief sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is beyond my department now," she finally said. "These allegations involve corruption at the highest levels of town government and potentially a murder that was covered up. I'm going to have to bring in the state police." Within days, the state police opened an official investigation. Real detectives, not just small-town officers, started looking into Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance. They interviewed people, examined old records, and began building a timeline of events from October 1978. They also brought in forensic accountants to look at what remained of the hospital project finances. What they found was damning. Even with incomplete records, the pattern was clear. Money had been systematically diverted from the hospital fund into various shell companies and consulting fees that went nowhere. The accountants estimated that at least $400,000 had been stolen, maybe more. $400,000 in 1978 money. That would be worth millions today. It was more than enough motive for murder. The investigation kicked up another storm of controversy. David Thornton hired expensive lawyers who threatened to sue everyone involved. They claimed the investigation was harassment of a respected family based on flimsy evidence. They accused the state police of pursuing a political agenda. But the investigation continued. And then came the breakthrough that changed everything. A construction company was doing work on an old property that had belonged to the Thornton family. It was a house that Richard Thornton had owned but never lived in, using it instead as a rental property over the years. The current owner had bought it from the Thornton estate after Richard died and was finally doing major renovations. Workers were digging up the backyard to install a new septic system when one of them hit something with his shovel. At first he thought it was a rock, but as he cleared away more dirt, he realized it was something else, something that made him drop his shovel and step back. He called his supervisor. The supervisor called the owner. The owner called the police. Within an hour, the property was swarmed with law enforcement. They'd found human remains. Old remains that had been buried there for decades. The remains were carefully excavated and sent to the state forensic lab. DNA testing would take time, but dental records provided a faster answer. The bones belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. The news hit Millbrook like an earthquake. Even the people who defended the Thorntons had trouble arguing with physical evidence. Eleanor Whitmore hadn't left town to pursue her career. She'd been murdered and buried like trash on property belonging to the very man she'd been investigating. Linda got the news from Claire, who called her the moment the identification was confirmed. Linda sat down heavily on her couch, feeling sick. She'd suspected it all along, but knowing for certain was different. Eleanor Whitmore had walked out of this house almost 50 years ago and been killed for trying to do the right thing. The forensic analysis told a grim story. Eleanor had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She'd been struck multiple times. The attack had been violent and personal. This wasn't some accident or robbery gone wrong. Someone had wanted her dead and had made sure of it. Police also found traces of fabric with the remains. The pattern matched the dress Eleanor had been wearing in a photo from October 1978. She'd never even had a chance to pack that suitcase someone had planted at the train station. The state police now had a murder investigation and clear evidence of a cover-up. The question was who to charge. Richard Thornton was long dead. Walter Grant, the police chief who'd shut down the investigation, had died in 2003. Many of the other officials involved in the hospital project were also dead. But David Thornton was very much alive, and the investigation turned its attention to him. Detectives discovered that David had been 23 in 1978, working as his father's assistant. He'd been involved in the hospital project, helping with paperwork and coordination. He'd have known about the embezzlement. The question was, had he been involved in Eleanor's murder? They also found something else. Evidence that David had known about Eleanor's remains. When his father died in 1995, David had inherited the rental property where Eleanor was buried, but he'd never sold it, never developed it, never done anything with it that might have disturbed the ground. He'd kept it as a rental for 30 years, making sure no one dug too deep in that backyard. Even more damning, investigators found emails from 10 years ago where David had argued against selling the property. Even though it wasn't profitable as a rental, his stated reason was sentimental value, but the timing was suspicious. He'd been working hard to keep that land under his control. The lawyers worked overtime to find anything else that might implicate David in either the original crime or the subsequent cover-up. What they eventually found was a sworn statement from the original town treasurer, who'd worked with Richard Thornton. The man had died in 2015, but before he passed, he'd written a detailed confession and left it with his attorney to be opened only after his death. In the statement, the treasurer described how Richard Thornton had ordered Eleanor's murder and forced several other officials to help cover it up. He described how David, even as a young man, had helped dispose of evidence and create the fake trail suggesting Eleanor had left town. He described years of threats and intimidation to keep people quiet. The treasurer had lived with the guilt his whole life, but had been too scared to come forward while the Thorntons still had power. His confession from beyond the grave now provided the final pieces of the puzzle. With this evidence, the state attorney general's office made their move. David Thornton was arrested at his home early one morning. The charges were serious: accessory to murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering. The arrest made national news. A small-town corruption case from the 70s had turned into a modern-day reckoning. Reporters descended on Millbrook from everywhere. The story had everything: small-town corruption, a murdered piano teacher, decades of cover-up, and justice finally served. For Linda and her family, watching David Thornton being led away in handcuffs felt surreal. They'd just been renovating an old house. They'd found a piano, and from that simple discovery had come all of this. But for Eleanor Whitmore's former students and friends, many now elderly themselves, it was a moment they'd waited half a lifetime to see. Finally, someone was being held accountable. Finally, Eleanor's story was being told. Finally, the truth was out. The trial of David Thornton lasted 6 weeks and gripped not just Millbrook but the entire state. Every day the courtroom was packed with people who'd known Eleanor Whitmore, people who'd been affected by the hospital project, and citizens who just wanted to see justice done. The prosecution laid out a devastating case. They showed how Richard Thornton and several other officials had systematically stolen from the hospital fund. They proved that Eleanor Whitmore had discovered the theft and planned to expose it. They demonstrated that her murder had been ordered to silence her, with multiple people involved in both the killing and the cover-up. David Thornton's lawyers tried to argue that he'd been young and under his father's control, that he'd been scared and manipulated. They painted him as another victim of Richard Thornton's corruption. But the evidence told a different story. David had actively participated in the cover-up for decades. He'd worked to keep Eleanor's burial site undiscovered. He'd inherited his father's ill-gotten money and used it to build his own wealth and influence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, David Thornton was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. Given his age, it was likely a life sentence. As the verdict was read, Linda sat in the courtroom gallery holding a photograph of Eleanor Whitmore. She'd brought it to remind herself why all of this mattered. A woman had been murdered for trying to protect her community. That woman deserved to have her story end with justice, even if it came far too late. The trial verdict wasn't the end of the story, though. The state investigation had uncovered evidence of other crimes, other cover-ups, other instances where the Thornton family and their associates had abused power. More arrests followed. 2 other elderly men who'd been part of the original conspiracy were charged as accessories after the fact for their role in the cover-up. The stolen hospital funds became a major issue. Forensic accountants managed to trace some of the money through multiple accounts and transactions over the years. A portion of it had been used to build David Thornton's business empire. The courts ordered those assets seized and liquidated. The money recovered, close to $2 million after decades of appreciation and investments, was designated for a special fund. After much community discussion, a decision was made. The money would go toward building a new wing of the Millbrook Medical Center, the hospital that had finally been completed years after Eleanor's death. But this new wing would be different. It would be dedicated to children's services, including a music therapy program. The new wing would be called the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Children's Center. Her name, hidden for so long, would now be visible to everyone who entered the hospital. Her story would be told through a permanent exhibit in the hospital lobby, ensuring that future generations would know what she'd done and what it had cost her. Linda and her family were invited to the groundbreaking ceremony. It was a beautiful spring day, almost exactly a year after they'd found Eleanor's piano. The whole town turned out. Even people who'd initially doubted Eleanor's story came to pay their respects. The evidence had been too overwhelming, and many felt ashamed that they'd defended the Thorntons. The mayor, who'd been elected after the scandal broke, gave a speech about integrity and courage. She talked about how Eleanor Whitmore had stood alone against corruption, how she'd given her life for a community that had initially forgotten her. But the most moving moment came when Eleanor's former students gathered around the piano that Linda had donated to the hospital. The old Steinway had been beautifully restored by a master craftsman. It gleamed in the hospital lobby, looking much as it must have in Eleanor's music room all those years ago. One by one, Eleanor's former students sat at the piano and played pieces their teacher had taught them. Some were in their 60s now, with arthritic fingers and fading memories. But when they touched those keys, something came back to them. The music Eleanor had shared with them decades ago flowed through the hospital lobby. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Linda found herself crying as an elderly man with white hair played a simple Chopin nocturne. He finished, rested his hands on the keys for a moment, and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore, for everything you taught me, not just about music, The hospital also created a special archive room where Eleanor's journal, her photographs, and her original musical compositions were displayed. People could come and read her own words, see her face in the pictures, understand the full scope of what had happened. It was important that the truth be available, not sanitized or simplified, but told completely. Claire Patterson won a state journalism award for her coverage of the case. In her acceptance speech, she talked about the importance of local journalism, of asking questions even when powerful people don't want them asked. She dedicated the award to Eleanor Whitmore and to Henry Fletcher, the old detective who'd finally found the courage to speak up. Henry Fletcher himself passed away 6 months after David Thornton's conviction. He was buried with full honors, and many people in Millbrook attended his funeral. He'd lived with guilt for decades, but in the end, he'd done the right thing. His testimony had been crucial to the case. For the Mitchell family, life slowly returned to normal, though they'd never forget what they'd been through. They finished renovating their house, though they kept the music parlor exactly as it had been. That room where Eleanor had written her journal and played her piano felt sacred now. Tommy, who'd been so excited about the hidden room when they first found it, developed an interest in journalism because of everything that happened. He started a blog about local history and mysteries, inspired by how one discovery could change so much. Lisa became fascinated by Eleanor's music and started taking piano lessons. She worked her way through some of Eleanor's original compositions, pieces that hadn't been played in 50 years. Linda would sit and listen, amazed at how the music still had power, still moved people. Even little Jack understood in his own way that something important had happened. He liked to tell people that Eleanor Whitmore's ghost protected their house now, keeping it safe. Linda didn't have the heart to correct him. In a way, maybe he was right. Eleanor's presence, her story, her courage, did seem to fill the old Victorian mansion. The town of Millbrook changed too. The scandal had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. People realized that trust had to be earned and constantly maintained. They paid more attention to town finances, demanded transparency, asked hard questions. The corruption that had once seemed normal was now unacceptable. A group of citizens started an annual Eleanor Whitmore Award, given to someone in the community who showed courage in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The first recipient was Claire Patterson. The second was a high school student who'd exposed bullying in the school administration. Eleanor's musical compositions were compiled into a book and published. The proceeds went to music education programs in underfunded schools. Musicians around the state began performing her works in concerts. A piece she'd written called Morning in Millbrook became particularly popular, its gentle melody capturing something essential about small-town life. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Eleanor's remains, a memorial service was held at the old cemetery where she was finally, properly buried. Her grave marker was simple but elegant, listing her dates in a single phrase. She stood for truth. Hundreds of people attended the service. Some had known Eleanor personally. Others had only learned about her through the trial and the news coverage. But they all felt connected to her story somehow. In a world where it often seemed like the powerful could do whatever they wanted, Eleanor Whitmore's story was a reminder that truth matters, that justice matters, even if it takes decades. Linda placed flowers on the grave, as she'd done every week since Eleanor was buried. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the piano teacher she'd never met but had come to know so well through her journal. "We did it," Linda whispered. "We told your story, and people listened." A breeze rustled through the cemetery trees, and for just a moment Linda could almost hear music on the wind.